what are Crazy Slot's other numbers? There might be a way to tell what they are, and it's by finding some other rules about the Hatsu that aren't said out loud. Crazy Slots is described as a random toolbox power, where you summon a random tool out of all the ones in the toolbox to work with. It's meant for fighting, so all the numbers are good for combat, but this explanation doesn't cover what specific purpose and lifestyle this Hatsu was designed to be ideal for, why it's worthwhile for the tools to be random, or what strengths of the user, Kite, this ability is supposed to resonate with. So maybe, if we consider the specific design choices made to fit these other criteria, the actual possibilities of the other Crazy Slots numbers get trimmed down a lot. I think we can narrow down what the other weapons are in 3 steps. First, we take everything we know about the Hatsu so far, the strengths of the person behind it, and the intentions behind its design, and see if when they're all considered together, extra rules and mechanics might exist that connect the otherwise seemingly unrelated weapon designs of numbers 2, 3, and 4, and limit what the numbers we haven't seen can be. Second, we use those rules to come up with design trends that every weapon would follow. By overlapping every pattern, all the trends that each weapon number would need to follow, we might find that there's only one type of weapon that stands out for each specific slot. And then third, with an idea of what the other Crazy Slots numbers could be, based on an idea of what additional rules limiting their variety there might be, we can see if there's any evidence elsewhere outside of Crazy Slots itself that would support at least 2 of the weapon ideas we've come up with. Whether there's an inspiration for Crazy Slots or a similar concept later used in the series that suggests Crazy Slots was originally designed with a specific weapon in mind that fits one of our guesses. If we can find these for at least 2 of our hypothetical numbers, then it suggests that our hypothetical rules are true, so then our other examples for numbers are more likely to be accurate. To start off, Crazy Slots is not a gambling Hatsu. When you're designing a Nen power, you can theoretically do anything, as long as there's no counteracting struggle. If you don't have to worry about any urgency, pushback, or competition, and you can achieve an effect through a really intricate application of the 6 mechanics of the Nen categories, then it can theoretically be achieved through Nen. The hard part is efficiency. You want something you can use as forcefully and reliably as possible, and you want to be sure that it's something your recall, your head cache, can store without running out of space. Which is why you want ability details that follow the ways you already think as much as possible. But also, the simpler an ability, the more efficiently it can run. But I don't mean simpler as in it's a simple concept. I mean the logical framework, the algorithm that takes the basic Nen mechanics and applies them to produce the desired effect, is as small as possible. Which means what the ability lets you actually consciously do at will is minimal and barely flexible. It would limit you to something incredibly specific because that would be algorithmically easier to write. To people who just want to be able to use Nen and don't want to have to learn the academic skills to break down logic structures, it's easier to just get them to think about the effect they want and then have them simplify what it ends up being by having them think about restrictions. So the more limited in scope Kite's weapons are, the more blueprints for mechanics they can share to reduce the storage space of the Hatsu. But there's a second type of condition that makes Nen more effective. Your instincts can sometimes kick in to fight against something you're trying to do. For survival's sake, it's scary to let someone commit to something 100% and trust it with their life, because people can always slip up, miss a bigger picture, or be misled. But your instincts don't always have to work against your intentions. If you're in a crisis and your instincts are on board with what you're trying to do, they can give you unrestricted actions to encourage use of your motor functions instead. Because the general concept is that rather than your instincts pushing against your movements and decisions, the situation is desperate enough that your instincts have to trust and support them. Theoretically, you could cause this effect on command and force your instincts to be on board with what you do, although there are obviously complications that make this a bad idea. If you wanted to break your sprinting record, so you unleashed a tiger at the starting point, you'd probably be able to run faster than usual. And with Nen, because you are solidifying a Hatsu over time, you can make a rigid mechanic that puts your life in danger and forces your instincts to give you free rein over your motor functions, which for a Nen user would include their ability to wield aura. Characters like Kurapika use this type of condition to draw out and use their powers more aggressively, without restraint. Since this applies intensity to Ren, to the force they apply through aura, to their speed and the behaviors of their aura, and to the efficiency of their Hatsu, a scary enough situation can get someone to apply their Nen with enough intensity to match someone with way more aura who isn't as desperate. And to separate these types of conditions from the other type, the limitations, these conditions are generally called vows. Kite isn't a gambler. He's very responsible and values accountability. He cares about wildlife and nature, but takes the bigger picture into account, preserving ecosystems and prioritizing the long-term stability of nature over individual lives. So while he does care about animals, he'll fight invasive species and euthanize creatures to adhere to some kind of code he holds himself to. He's not a gambler, but he does care about efficiency and holding every creature accountable as a cog in nature's wider machine. So if his power does select a weapon for him to use beyond his control, it probably won't truly be random. Not to mention, Hatsu as a concept seems to be based on algorithms and computer logic, where true randomness doesn't exist, and which is exploited by Jing, the computer theory expert, who taught Kite how to approach designing abilities. For computers, when they want to simulate randomness, they'll pick a number produced by a logical formula that's too complex for the person to calculate in time. So it can seem random to any human user, or to any other machine it's talking to, but it secretly got that number from something that is predetermined and predictable if you know the formula. And for Nen efficiency, the benefit of randomness is the desperation caused when you're forced to work with one limited power and can't swap to something else until you've used it. That seems to be why all the Crazy Slot's numbers are at least still weapons, and need Kite to use their effects before he can reroll them. They let him draw more intensity out of a simpler concept, its efficiency. And since true randomness wouldn't be produced by the Hatsu itself, Crazy Slots would likely work by coming up with a formula to decide what number is rolled. But desperation, the benefit of a vow, would come from how Kite has no conscious control over what limited weapon he has to fight with. It doesn't matter how random they actually are. So, Kite could have made it so that Crazy Slots uses his unconscious processing, which is much faster than his conscious analysis, to determine what weapon would be the best for each situation, which would consciously take too long to analyze anyway. So it would be improving his summoning time and his weapon choice accuracy, and making him desperate from having no conscious control over the weapon he's stuck with, boosting his efficiency on two fronts with a single mechanic. After all, if Crazy Slots were a gambling-based power, there wouldn't be only one slot that just chooses which of multiple usable options you get. It would be a jackpot power requiring multiple slots to roll the right answer, or a roulette power with harmful options to offset the good ones. But algorithmically, those wouldn't have the same benefits. They also wouldn't be inspired by computer theory, like a Jing-taught Hatsu symbolically should. But since the only value of fair randomness would be desperation, a jackpot power would just be an accumulation type that uses desperation to make you good enough with other rolls, and uses the aura you were saving up while using them to boost the eventual power of the jackpot. And a roulette power would produce a wider variety of outcomes that are more transformative or environmental, rather than all the slots being tangible tools. Kite wants weaponry out of all the things he could learn to conjure, because it fits two needs at once. A Nen user needs to design their special ability around the danger of having to fight other Nen users, and the actions they generally want to achieve that they can use Nen for. So in Kite's case, weapons are good because not only do they add to his fighting power, like normal weapons would in a non-Nen fight, they'd also let him deal with varied threats against ecosystems. In environmental hazards, species with different physiological strengths, and entire harmful or invasive populations. The value of tools throughout human history has been that no matter how hard you train your muscles or technique, human bodies are only so good at certain tasks. So using specific materials in specific structures lets you apply your base strength in a way that's more effective for a specific activity. If you want to break something tougher than the human body, like rocks, you can use a pickaxe. If you want to rein in animals, for sure, and also keep your hands free, you can use a leash. This is why a swordsman who uses sharpened steel will always be valuable no matter how strong somebody else learns to punch with their body. Like plain aura, the human body is only a flexible foundation for your power. A tool lets you complement your basic strength and apply it in one specific way, so you can overcome disadvantages. And unlike pure conjurers, who are good at pouring all of their imagination into one specific idea, someone like Kite, who leans toward transmutation, is also good with transmutation's affinity for flexibility. So he can be good at conjuring multiple versions of a basic concept, depending on the scenario, which is how Crazy Slots would work. So maybe the 9 specific weapons have been chosen to be able to give Kite advantage in as many conflict scenarios as possible, taking both Nen battles and natural hazards into account. The way this would work would be by figuring out 9 ways to break down obstacles into different arrangements that Kite would have disadvantage in, so the tool he'd summon can be something that bridges that gap and applies his strength to have advantage in that kind of conflict. To simplify it, if you can divide threats into 9 categories, Kite only has to be able to summon 9 weapons to overcome pretty much any of them. While this would be generalizing hazards, since there aren't only 9 scenarios you can end up in, it would theoretically work because you're just analyzing the structure the enemy advantage takes and equipping a more appropriate tool. Numbers are the same thing. You can't exactly have one apple, since apples are an object type with a bit of an imperfect and fluid definition, and objects aren't fully identical to each other on an atomic level. But you can still generally convey comparisons and measurements by breaking apples down into quantities, like 4 apples being less than 5 apples. And you can even do this to divisions of an apple, eyeballing or measuring how much a tenth of an apple would be, for example. Math makes trade more effective, even if there can always be duds, conjoined apples, or differing masses. Because overall, you can more efficiently handle resource management if you apply the concept of numbers and counting to your resources. On top of computer theory, Hunter x Hunter and its power system incorporate ideas from Taoism, and one related concept that breaks down fundamental structures into 8 directional values, organizing information like a sorting algorithm to more effectively analyze anything that can come from any conceptual direction, would be the trigrams. 8 general concepts you can divide anything like a hazard surrounding you into, so you can better analyze it and tailor your response. Even if the trigram categories can feel pretty arbitrary for certain obstacles, getting used to identifying them and responding to them narrows down the approaches you need to use against any single threat, and boosts your efficiency in any scenario. In Naruto, the clan with X-ray vision used this principle to identify the human body's universal weak points in the people around them, so they can attack those weak points with precision and speed and prevent their opponents from attacking back. What Kite would need to do would be to identify 9 general shapes problems take. So if his tools just have to be somewhat more effective against them, and he also saves time by automatically narrowing down the type of threat he's dealing with, and then the lack of control creates a feeling of desperation to boost his aura's intensity, Crazy Slots would be a feasible way to give him type advantage against any plausible scenario. So if Crazy Slots takes after the concept of trigrams, then the first 8 numbers correspond to all the directions around him, the 8 different scenario types where there are 8 different angles there could be a power gap. So the weapon Kite summons pivots his power around that to give Kite advantage in that particular type of encounter. We just have to figure out what the most universal way to categorize conflict scenario power gaps into 8 groups would be. And then, one restriction for Crazy Slots could be that just like normal weapons meant to add to a human's strength in one specific way, 8 of the 9 weapons are meant to boost Kite's effectiveness to give him type advantage in those scenarios to overcome most power gaps, like with Pokemon types. And then, playing off of Kite's appreciation of wildlife and prioritizing the sustainability of the wider ecosystem over individual lives, the 9th weapon could be for when even type advantage isn't enough to make a difference. So it's something that looks past the fight entirely uses the reproduction of creatures around him, and lets him survive in the bigger picture by abandoning his physical body. I don't think the weapon that let Kite reincarnate was number 3. If he could summon the weapon right away, then he would never be desperate enough to get his survival instincts to propel his post-mortem Nen. So that's why a specific condition might be that he has to summon another weapon first, and survive long enough with that one to let it really sink in that even with the best weapon he has, he can't win no matter what. And based on what I imagine the trigram scenarios would be, number 3 was the appropriate one to deal with Pito. The gap was just too wide to clear. Also, whether it's an axe or a mace, it's still modeled after a weapon with a heavy shape at the end of a stick so you can whack things with it. Number 3 is a type of weapon that's still meant to be easily lethal, even if it's not for as big attacks as number 2. I'd imagine the escape weapon would be the type that requires more expert control to wield at all, and would primarily be designed to stall to keep the user feeling desperate. So rather than a mace, a whip, or an axe, something like a staff. If I had to guess what the 8 trigrams of combat encounters would be, they'd be pairs representing the 4 different lines you can draw from the 8 different directions, where they'd be opposite scenarios of the same type of power gap, meaning 1 and 2 would be opposites, 3 and 4 would be opposites, and so on. The 4 types of disadvantages would be in the distribution of threats, the range of threats, the quantity of threats, and the speed of threats. So if weapon number 2 is for when your obstacles are all around you and overwhelming to all deal with at once, number 1 could be for when your obstacles are hard to all deal with because they're behind each other, lined up in one direction. Numbers 3 and 4 already match as opposite advantages, because number 4 is a rifle, good for when you can't get close to an enemy and have to take them out from far away, and number 3 is a short melee tool you can twirl around, so it's good for when you're up against agile melee fighters, by boosting your own agility against them, letting you bend around their moves and lock their limbs up, and dispersing the force of their attacks by blocking them with the flat ends of the heavy part. There's one more trend we might be able to identify with the 3 weapons we've seen, and similar to Gon being left a clue by Jing in Greed Island, we'd only be able to make this pattern out because we were given weapons right next to each other and only one away from the bottom. Which is that, for variety reasons, some weapons might rely on more specific mechanics or complex structures, even if this reduces how restrictive or efficient they are. So I'd imagine every weapon is balanced on a spectrum, where the higher a number is, the more complex it can be, so the more it can rely on an advanced concept, and the lower a number is, the more it relies on desperation power to be incredibly strong with a basic direction of attack. Number 2 and number 3, which are right next to each other and in the bottom trio, are both melee weapons, painful shapes on sticks you hit things with. And number 4 is a more complex type of weapon, a firearm, but there isn't anything special about its ammunition, and it's clunky and hard to move around for the small holes it creates. So I'd bet Crazy Slots divides the weapons into trios, where for 1 to 3 you'd start off with basic melee tools, but number 1 is so restrictive it only lets you attack in one direction. Number 2 is freer in range, hitting all around you, but still limits you to a single movement. And number 3 is so freeing that it boosts your movement. Then from number 4, we get the projectile weapons, and what goes up is the complexity of the ammunition, with number 4 giving you the least range of damage, for the tedious work involved to position it and fire each shot, number 5 firing a type of material with special properties, and number 6 firing projectiles that have complex structures themselves. Our last category from 7 onwards would be more specialized types of battle gadgets, tools that are complicated to use and have distinct supernatural effects like regular conjurer powers, where for efficiency's sake, the higher numbers would be able to perform more effects, but would also require more conditions to follow and expertise in order to use. To simplify, the trends from low to high would be that the melee start with really restrictive movement to the freest movement, the projectile weapons have increasingly complex types of ammunition, and the last 3 have increasingly specific or layered functionality, requiring more conditions to activate. With both the trigram criteria and the complexity spectrum, I think we can narrow down one fitting weapon for each Crazy Slot's number. Starting with number 1, if the goal is a melee weapon that pierces defenses to attack everything in a straight line, It's supposed to be more restrictive than the scythe that already has you stand still in order to attack with it, and that means it's going to have more power in the region it does attack. The best fitting weapon would be a spear, one that you're not allowed to throw, but would build up such force that it can still hit things pretty far away, because it's meant to pierce through anything within its range. We know numbers 2 through 4, so that brings us to number 5. A firearm with more destruction for the amount of work required to pull the trigger, and ammunition that has a distinct property. For the trigram, 1 and 2 were enemy distribution, and 3 and 4 were range, so 5 and 6 could be quantity, tools to overcome situations where the enemies seem to keep multiplying, which would be handy if you're fighting an infestation of weak creatures or one continuous mass of obstacles. The question would be whether 5 or 6 is the weapon meant to be good in situations where the enemies seem to multiply or replace each other by themselves, so you have to constantly attack the horde rather than individual opponents. And the other weapon would be good in situations where the enemy waves all depend on one specific spawner or director. The fitting opposite weapons for quantity disadvantages could be a weapon for when you deal with a continuous flood of enemies, versus a weapon for when all the key players are in one place. Because 5's ammunition is a type of substance, and 6 is meant to fire individually complex structures, I think it fits more if number 5 is the one that's good against a generally multiplying horde. One where you need to destroy all of it, and can't stop attacking, or waste time targeting individual bodies. So a flamethrower. Assuming every weapon needs to be used in some way before they can be re-rolled, and numbers 1 and 2 need Kite to perform their specific attacks in order to be put away, number 4 might only need Kite to fire it once before he can summon something else. A rifle is meant for single shots, if you can help it, and Kite's not as restricted as he would be with a lower number. But a flamethrower produces a constant stream of fire, so I'd imagine it would start with a full tank of fuel, and Kite would have to use it up before he could put the flamethrower away, although he would be able to refill the tank by spending aura. Flames are a more intricate type of substance with more functionality altogether than something like a bullet. So then, if number 6 launches a really intricate piece of technology, something that's some kind of device itself, over distances to attack specific concentrations of the critical units of an enemy horde, then a fitting weapon would be a rocket launcher. 7 and 8 are the weapons I'm the least confident about, because now all the guidelines are hypothetical. For numbers 5 and 6, we had the same weapon type as number 4, and for number 1, we had the weapon type and the trigram direction. But now we're guessing what the weapon type would be with no actual examples, and we're also guessing the type of advantage. So with nothing else, let's figure out what type of general hazard factor isn't accounted for by the other weapons. We have weaponry good against various positioning of enemies, distances of enemies, and substitution conditions of enemies. One thing Kite has no counters for is a speed concern. There are no weapons to deal with enemies that are too fast to normally hit, whether this means they're weak but impossible to catch and gradually get hits in, or because they only need to attack once with something like Venom, and it's guaranteed to do you in after long enough. Numbers 7, 8, and 9 are tools that have their own special abilities, and the higher the number, the more conditions to activate its effect there would likely be, but the more flexible or complex the effect would be too. So, if you want something that can act fast to counter a batch of enemies too nimble to match up to normally, this would be number 7, so it can activate right away, and it would be more of a stunning weapon with lighter damage. Because this is the number trio, where the weapon themes would get a little quirky, like normal conjuration tools, a stun effect could be achieved with a weapon that's still potentially lethal, but isn't single-use if it blends the themes of sound damage as the mechanism and explosive detonators as the type of tool, in the form of a boombox, one that conjures sound which can spread fast around the area nearby, with the property to stun whoever it reaches. While the force of the sound can harm people, it's prioritizing faster hits and spreading the damage to primarily stun targets, leaving the choice of finishing them off up to Kite. Think of it like the spy's sapper in MVM. Actually, just think of all the numbers like the advantages of the TF2 classes, especially against broader types of threats than other people like the robot waves in MVM. Number 1 would be the heavy because he focuses on single direction damage and relies on the bullet piercing upgrade. Number 2 would be the Demo Man for swinging longer melee weapons around and attacking robots surrounding spots he camps. Number 3 would be the Scout because it's a shorter melee weapon for boosting your agility to surpass your opponents and overwhelm them. Number 4 would be the Sniper because it's a sniper rifle with the same advantages. Number 5 would be the Pyro because it's a flamethrower with the same advantages. And number 6 would be the Soldier because you get the pattern. So number 7 would be the Spy, good for immediate close-range attacks that catch the enemy off guard. And number 8 would then be the Medic. You want a tool that can act after the fact, if you've been hit with an attack that's guaranteed to beat you after long enough, like the surprise bite of a venomous beast. So a weapon that requires steps to activate its effect, but then tailors what its effect is meant to be, ends up being a benefit for this type of scenario. Taking after the Medic, I'm imagining this could be a syringe that could deal damage by stabbing someone, but is more useful as a recovery tool. Closer to a conventional conjurer power, this could be something like an empty syringe that makes any kind of serum you want as long as you complete its instructions to fill it with what it lists on the side. This way, you can make something like an antivenom for an unknown species that bit you by extracting some of your blood, some material from the creature's corpse, and maybe some of a nearby food source. The requirement to re-roll the syringe could be to fill and empty it, with some degree of ingredient accuracy. Maybe that just makes the effect stronger, or reduces how much aura you need to use. Number 9 would be the power that requires Kite to qualify for Postmortem Nen in order to be usable. Something that would force him to realize he's doomed and fight to stay alive rather than to win before he could summon it. And because of mythology reasons, I'm imagining it's a staff. Because it's a type of weapon that requires expertise to use, it's not lethal in everyone's hands, but it can be used to overwhelm an enemy with proficiency. So it would be just usable enough to keep Kite feeling desperate so he can still qualify for Postmortem Nen throughout the time it ultimately takes to kill him. And because Postmortem Nen loses its adaptability, if the staff is meant to prioritize stalling, then the longer Kite can survive with it, the more effective and precise he can set up his postmortem function to be. Staffs are also associated with magic, but the biggest reason I think it's appropriate here is because of the Greek mythology I think it could be based on. There's the story of Tiresias seeing 2 snakes, whacking them with a stick, and then turning into a woman for 7 years as a consequence, or alternatively turning into a mouse, which still fits Kite's type of chimera ant. An oracle, so someone who looks toward the future and is aware of the bigger picture, who gets transformed as punishment for something. It's not a perfect comparison to what happened to Kite, but when you consider the mechanisms that would be involved in how Kite reincarnated, a lot more details align. As a conjurer, old Kite's postmortem Nen would have likely involved conjuring something that would exist after his death to let his existence and memories transfer to a new body. Kite was reborn as the underdeveloped twin of the Chimera Ant King in the womb of the Queen, and not just another ant which are usually laid from eggs. Conjuration temporarily manifests something in the environment, but this means that if organics are involved, like living and growing creatures, conjuration could be used to make a mold that permanent real cells then slowly fill in. So if someone who thinks about wildlife, ecosystems, and life cycles wants to use conjuration to revive after death, the easiest thing they could do is have a postmortem ability that looks for a suitable pregnant creature nearby and then branches from that fetus by conjuring the mold for a twin. The parent's womb is already supplying nutrients and facilitating their growth. So if Kite limited his targets to something close enough to humans, then it would explain why he only branched off of Merowim, the closest humanoid fetus developing like a mammal in a womb nearby. Mouse Kite can't use Nen, but because Kite's memories were transferred over, then even though his body was supposedly able to access crazy slots when puppeteered by Pito, there's a good chance she'll be able to use the Hatsu again too. But if we consider that Kite designed the ability to be reborn as a human, then a reasonable estimate for the age a reincarnation would be able to physically handle reawakening Nen could be around 7. Though the main reason I think Tiresias would be the biggest inspiration would be the snakes. If Kite needed to conjure something that would exist post-mortem to carry out his reincarnation, then playing into the idea of life cycles, growth, and rebirth, a fitting conjuration would be a creature that can shed its skin. As Kurapika eventually pointed out, obvious symbolism makes conjurations more effective, but a supernatural snake based on the idea of shedding skin could also be harder to exercise, because it could collapse and reform unharmed a few meters away whenever threatened. Also, unless they're complex enough to have their own Nen affinities, conjurations would be conduits to still run on the user's Nen affinity in order to achieve their functions. Postmortem Nen can travel pretty far and persist as long as it needs to work, but to give his ability some degree of reliability, Kite would probably want to engineer it to use emission and manipulation to find his target and sync up his vessel. Snakes sense through vibrations, so the boombox cuts costs, but because Kite isn't good with these categories, he might have chosen to conjure complex enough life forms to have their own Nen types, which would mean he'd summon 2 snakes. And because he can't manipulate them, he'd have to conjure them with instincts to be drawn to a specific instrument they can focus their Hatsu into, so Kite can channel them for his own uses. By conjuring a staff along with 2 snakes, Kite would be making a pole for the snakes to tangle around for the sake of making him a new body, like how the snakes were tangled together Uzumaki style to procreate in the Tiresias story. A staff with 2 snakes on it is also the tool of the Greek deity Hermes, with powers to supposedly swap opposites of things. And if the snakes only exist to perform their roles, which happen one at a time, then if a target has been found before Kite dies, the first emitter snake can disappear. And then, ready to start reincarnating right away, the staff would only have 1 snake on it, like the one used by Asclepius, the deity of medicine. The logical and most efficient way a reincarnation ability could function for Kite, like the way we see his does, would align with 3 separate Greek mythological references. So I don't think they'd be unrelated. That doesn't mean the reincarnation weapon is number 3 though. Number 3 is good for outmaneuvering an agile melee fighter, but to keep the overall Hatsu as straightforward as possible, the most it can probably do is extend a rope to trap an opponent, or pop the head as the tedious condition to re-roll it. Although that's assuming how it works because we've only seen 2 and 4 do anything. And to give any of our weapon guesses or formulas any assurance, we'd need to find a couple of motifs in the author's work before or after the Chimera Ant arc that would support the idea that these are what the weapons for Crazy Slots were intended to be. Crazy Slots is partly inspired by Suzuki and Kuwabara from Yu Yu Hakusho. Kuwabara's general power is a sword he can shape out of his aura, like Gon's scissors, but he can transform this aura into different weapons, and the pretty mad clown Suzuki builds and provides him with a physical sword that has a unique power for each person that uses it. And in Kuwabara's case, it has the power to turn into different things depending on what he needs. Kuwabara's ultimate aura sword transformation is a special sword that cuts through dimensions, but he can only summon it when his instincts are on board with what he's doing. So there's a pretty strong parallel between Kite and Kuwabara, making weapons from their auras, how clowns provide tools for them, and the condition to summon their final weapons. And the first transformation Kuwabara ever learns with his sword is to turn it into a spear, so he can skewer a line of charging enemies all at the same time, which I think supports the idea of Crazy Slot's weapon number 1 being the spear, which would also support the ideas of the trigram theming and the complexity spectrum. But I'd still want to find evidence of our specific guess of a 7-8 trigram, or of what the 9th weapon does. And if we look to the Succession War, I think there's evidence that these were the weapon designs for Crazy Slots, but that this is no longer going to be the case because of 2 specific elements. The first is that a syringe idea was eventually used for Kurapika, so there's less of a chance of it appearing as a separate power. But because of this next element, there is a better chance the idea originally came from Crazy Slots. And this next example is Silent Majority. It's a conjuration with the motif of entangled snakes that spawns snakes to attack someone. And because it was introduced in the same lesson Kurapika pointed out that conjurations rely on obvious symbolism, with a mystery around who the user could be, and then in the very next scene we were introduced to Seiko, who has a matching personality, fits all of the symbolism, and was the person who sent out the first vessel Silent Majority could attack from, it's implied that she's the user. The concept of a silent majority is a group that's oppressed, like pretty much all of Kakin, by the king. And the Hatsu is about infiltration and sabotage. It uses a subject, like a pawn, to get close to a group of desired targets, to then attack the other people there. So the mindset of the person who can use this power is probably filled with a desire for revolution, and the feeling that they don't have freedom or power despite the titles they've accumulated to get close to overthrowing their target. Like how the queens can be elevated to royal status from any walk of life, but don't have actual agency against the king, despite outnumbering him. And also like how immediately after Silent Majority's first exposed attack, Seiko knew that despite her status as a queen, she couldn't get away with speaking her mind when interrogated by Kaiser. I mean, look at what she says. She's Silent Majority. Look at its haircut, how it has a zipper for a mouth, how it has elegant clothing that signifies a luxurious position but only in a decorative way like the queen's. How when it thinks, it acts like Seiko when she thinks. How it knows the names of her guards. How Seiko has twins and had kids with the king to cement her status. How she uses her kids as pawns like Silent Majority uses her staff. It's really strongly implied to be her. But we can't say that it is for sure, because as much evidence as there might be, as much as the story implies it's Seiko, the fact it hasn't confirmed it yet means there's also as much of a chance it's preparing for a fake-out. But that doesn't matter for us, because we're looking at the story inspirations, which would still apply even if what they inspired are subversions. So for simplicity's sake, we're going to talk about the details of the scenario related to what we actually care about, like they're true. It worked for the last video. So if Seiko is Silent Majority's user, like the story wants us to think, then she'd probably be part of some kind of resistance movement against Nasubi, which means if there's anyone within the Kakin regime who would be her ally, it would be Beyond, because Beyond Netero is also trying to usurp power from Nasubi. And his signature trait is that he goes above and beyond and approaches any problem from an abundance of avenues because he prioritizes getting it done over any other costs. What he cares about is exploring the Dark Continent. What he's willing to do is ally with a random country and spend decades as a celebrity there to make the voyage easier once he gets permission to go. And just because it gives him more avenues, he's also willing to try to take that country over, which means he's probably not going to ally with just one force in Kakin. If he's working with the king, he's probably also reaching out to every other faction, so he'd probably also work with anyone else who's managed to get a spot among Kakin's elites, which in this case would be Seiko. He also has kids whenever he can, because they can only be assets for him. He'd have kids who'd be useful as assassins. He'd even have kids who wouldn't but are still worth making just in case, because it's advantageous if someone's there. And because Beyond is beyond Netero, he actually has a power to rein in his kids. Because aside from blackmail and the advantage of medical knowledge, he's gotta have some kind of ability that takes control of any of his biological offspring in order for it to be useful for his kid to win the succession war. Saraidnik looks and acts and thinks and pushes himself and expects things of others and seeks out fun like Isaac Netero, and is a massive hypocrite. And he was oddly chill entering the war without any kind of tool like Nen, so it's almost guaranteed that he's been promised help from Beyond and has been told he's Beyond's child. But Saraidnik would have had to have been conceived before Beyond knew all the details about the succession war. So Beyond picked one of the queens that was already established and tried to make sure he fathered her second child. And going above and beyond, but also gaining more intel from Nasubi, he was probably allowed to find out more details after making an agreement to help Kakin colonize the Dark Continent in exchange for being allowed to have a descendant in the succession war. He's been there long enough, Oido could easily be his child, which would make Wobble winning still count as a victory. But Nasubi being Nasubi, greedy, cruel, and uncontrollably protective of Kakin, never would have wanted some ambitious outsider like Beyond to have more power in the nation or skew succession results. So, he would have timed things so that the succession war would start when Beyond's prince would still only be an infant, and Beyond would be imprisoned and unable to help Wopal win. But Beyond Netero is the ultimate hunter, with a solution to the main weakness of hunters, which is that they're vulnerable whenever attacking their own prey, because Beyond constantly hunts and splits his attacks into as many directions as possible, so when a single enemy strikes, he has enough other attacks to cover his own back. When Nasubi informed him of the mechanics of the Succession War, he could have been motivated to have another child, so he could influence how they develop and what their reputation would be to make it so their Nen Beast could become the ultimate tool for his escape, using Nasubi's own protected system to get him back on the field and able to influence the war. Beyond would already have an ally, Seiko, which would explain why the twins were raised with the tunnel game to be so dependent on each other, why Seiko treats them as pawns, and why Fugetsu has recently been receiving strange injections when she's only been around the same person who sent out people that have been vessels for a sabotage power that has been consistently protecting Wobble, who we're suspecting is Beyond's descendant. But the problem would be that Beyond would no longer be able to hook up with one of the queens without Nasubi catching on, because he'd be under stricter surveillance after having learned about the ritual. So how could he conceive another child without physically hooking up or with Nasubi noticing an unexpected pregnancy? He could do it if he just conjured a mold for a twin to accompany an existing fetus. So if that's how Fugetsu was conceived, at least it's the most consistent sequence of events based on the details implied about Seiko, then both the idea of summoning snakes and the idea of conjuring a twin were used for Seiko's character, which, when Steel Chain is also taken into account, would suggest that some of the initial ideas for Crazy Slots have been repurposed for the Succession War. But it would mean that, if Kite ever does return, the Crazy Slots she does get will probably end up having different tools.